Good evening to all of you. This is the fourth Europe lecture that the Dutch Embassy has organized in the last 4 years. We can call it now an established tradition, always in the Nijmünster, in this intimate atmosphere. What's different today, I think, is that we will talk about Europe, Europe as an actor, but in a more global context, in a very unsafe context, as we all witness nowadays. What's also new is that the previous 3 editions we had a one-man show, meaning the embassy, and then I have to look at my deputy, Yvonne Ruiters, who always comes with the idea somewhere in spring, like also this spring, with the idea of having Rob de Wijk. But what's different now is that instead of having a one-man show, we have a 3-man show. We are partnering with both the Luxembourg Times, who has done a lot of promotion and the registration in advance for this event. And we are partnering with Europe Direct, which is a part of the University of Luxembourg. And they have done, and they are actually now doing the live streaming. So thanks for that. So very helpful partners. And then I would say we actually have a fourth partner, Minister Bausch. That's the Minister of Defense. Thank you for willing to give the concluding remarks after Professor de Wijk has given his introduction. But my thanks to all of you, Professor Lecluc, Vice Rector, thanks for joining us, and thanks for the help of your staff and your people here. Much appreciated. So what I propose is the following. Professor de Wijk will speak. He will do that with a lot of PowerPoint pictures, which I think is very good, and he will probably do it in a dynamic way by walking around, I guess. So that will be quite lively. And then after the speech, lecture, performance of Mr. de Wijk, the 3 of you will sit when Minister Bausch gives his concluding remarks. Douwe Miedema, the chief editor of Luxembourg Times, as the previous years, is again willing to moderate questions and answers, because we definitely want it to be a very interactive evening. So the speaker. For those who are not Dutch, it's worthwhile to mention that Professor de Wijk, who is not only a scientist, a thinker, but also a policy advisor, but also someone who reaches out to the general public in an almost daily podcast, which I heard has at least 1.5 million downloads per session, so almost per day. So can you just imagine, it's probably the same coverage as Dutch public television nowadays. And rightly so, it has been rewarded only a few weeks ago as the best podcast in the Netherlands. So congratulations for that, Professor de Wijk. You are first and foremost a security expert, but security is a very broad field, so it's not about bombs and grenades only. I had, of course, the chance of having a sneak preview through your slides. It's also about economic security. So I think for such a diverse group audience, there's a lot for you to discover. Professor de Wijk, I give you the floor.
If it works. Yeah, it works. Thank you. Minister, Ambassador, thank you so much for the invitation to speak here. It's really a great pleasure. Far away from home, but not that far away, because I also live in France, and that's even further. So sometimes we pass Luxembourg, I have to admit, and then we don't stop, but we should do it more often. What is my key message today? So what I would like to do is discuss a little bit what's going on in the world. We are really living in in a time of big monumental changes. That is needless to say. We saw it coming for at least 10 years, but now everybody believes it because there are two main events that draw all the attention. And one is, of course, the Ukraine war, and the other is what's happening in Asia, Taiwan. I've been asked by the media so often, do we get war in Taiwan? And you can't predict, that's impossible, but there are many frictions, and the same also, of course, for Russia. In a way, this was also a predicted conflict in Ukraine. In long time ago, when I was a civil servant at the MOD, I had the pleasure of being tasked by the Minister and the Chief of Defense to restructure the Dutch Armed Forces, and I was working also on the white papers a long time ago, after the end of the Cold War. What we did there is that we predicted that something could go horribly wrong in Ukraine, especially at the Crimea. And the reason was quite simple. We did not believe that Russia would accept that its main naval base was in another country. So it would act at a certain time, and it happened. So some things are really predictable, and we know for more than 10, 15 years now that the world is changing. This has to do with the rise of China, and that by definition this will create huge frictions in international politics. And the consequences we see right now. I don't know how it is in this country, because my most recent knowledge about the country is from Capitani, the Netflix series, which I found rather remarkable and very fun to watch, but there was nothing about international politics in the series. What we now see is something that was also predicted, and that is that raw materials, energy, are now used as a weapon. Smaller countries now come to the conclusion that it is indeed quite simple to put pressure on large parts of the world, especially the rich countries, the European Union, the US, by manipulating the flow of oil, gas, and other raw materials. And the problem is, and that is a very topical discussion now in the Netherlands, we got rid of energy from Russia. On the 5th of December, we will have this oil embargo. And now we have to turn to other parts of the world. And yes, indeed, we have to look at countries where human rights are violated at a large scale. So we have to make a choice now between the stability, the economic prosperity or the economic security of your own country and defending human rights elsewhere. And that is really a big problem. And simply, I don't know how it is here, but I see this struggle in Germany, I see it also in Belgium, and I see it in my country. So we need critical raw materials, CRM, oil and natural gas. And they're all exported by a systemic rival, China, or countries, for example, in the Middle East, which have a dubious reputation in the field of human rights. This had huge implications, really huge implications for foreign policy. Because foreign policy, and this also for all, let's say for the whole European Union, is usually driven by concerns about humanity, and for good reasons. I like that. But the problem is, now all of a sudden you come, because of geopolitical change, in a situation where you have no other choice but to buy critical raw materials, oil and gas, in countries you may not like. And that has huge implications for foreign policy. So this is part of the power struggle, and the power struggle, I can assure you, continues, because there is a lot of discussion going on about the collapse of China, but don't believe it, or the decoupling of China from the international order or the international economics, but don't believe it. This will continue for quite a while. And the reason is quite simple. A country of 1.4 billion inhabitants, if such a country start to develop, really that has an impact on the world, if you want it or not. Even a couple of percent extra growth have huge implications. But China is not doing that well. So what I read in the newspaper, that means that China will not be number one in the future. I doubt it. Predictions are very hard to make, but it is highly unlikely that in the long run China will not be number one in the world. But I have to admit that things are not going that well in China. COVID policies. Just to make to mention something that is really in the news right now, this really affects the economic growth of China. What we also see, and that is quite worrisome, I think that's the most worrisome of all, is a pressure put on the CEOs of the major high-tech firms. Jack Ma, funny enough, he disappeared from the screen, literally. And then after a while, he popped up just around the corner where I live, in the Netherlands, to buy, at least is what he tried, sea traders. And that is exactly what is needed in China, where they have a huge problem with feeding their own population. But what we do know is that there is much political pressure on those companies. And the reason is, of course, that they became too powerful. And because they became too powerful, they became a challenge for the communist leadership. And that is something people simply didn't, or at least not leadership, didn't want to allow. And but at the same time, the economic growth of China can only be explained by the high-tech sector. And here it is extremely important to remember that we are in the midst of a new industrial revolution. And I think that is something that is often forgotten, but this new industrial revolution is about artificial intelligence, about robotization, about Internet of Things, about 5, 6G. This is exactly the reason why President Trump started to put pressure on companies like Huawei, who tried to build the 5G systems in this part of the world. And now we see, of course, also all kinds of discussions on this within the European context. But this is crucial. And what we do know from history is that when a country becomes the champion of an industrial revolution, it will set the global rules of the game. That has always been the case. The UK did it in the 19th century, the US did it in the 20th century, and the big question is, who will do that in the 21st century? That is what it is. And so this is indeed a geopolitical struggle which has huge implications for the world, for the stability of the world, but also for the rules-based international relations we have, and those rules-based international relations are mainly created by us, the West. And if China will become number one, then it will of course have a huge impact on the rules-based international relations we see right now. Institutions will change, international law will change, values will change, and so the world will look like completely different. And for that reason, this is really a very, very important struggle. For that reason, it is no coincidence that Taiwan is the flashpoint. That's flashpoint number one. Flashpoint number two, this next one is Ukraine. But this is something that is also completely linked to the crisis we see right now in Russia and with the West, and of course on Ukraine. So what is the problem? This fourth industrial revolution is linked to the development of high-end and low-end semiconductors, chips. This is really at the heart of the revolution. What we see now is that 90% of the high-end semiconductors and 60% of all semiconductors is produced here at TSMC. TSMC is the main factory in the world. It's a huge factory, and this is crucial. If Russia carries out an intervention in Taiwan, that will be over. There will be no more chips from Taiwan. We know what will happen then if there is an intervention even if the workforce moves and doesn't want to work anymore in the factory, it's over. We don't get chips anymore. Then the crisis we have right now, the oil and gas crisis, the energy crisis in general, is nothing compared to what will happen if this happens. So what we see here is that this is really a struggle on semiconductors. This is not a struggle on the island. It happens to be that this factory is on the island, and that means that we have to think what we are going to do with this. The US is now working on it, and President Biden now puts a lot of money in a factory in Ohio, 20 billion, and they asked TSMC, could you please come to the US in order to build such a factory, because we need it. Without it, we are lost. A similar discussion takes place in the European Union. The problem, however, here is that it takes too long. You should do it right away, as soon as possible, because the time frame, the window of opportunity is not that big, maybe 5 to 10 years, that's what it is, not more. So you really have to act. And this is, of course, linked to the trade war started by Trump and now waged by President Biden. And this is about semiconductors. Semiconductors are produced, for example, with American tooling. A country, for example, Korea, using that tooling will be hit by sanctions by the US. So you're simply not capable of doing this. This also explains, for example, why ASML, that's the main provider, is a Dutch firm, the main provider of machines for producing chips, it's the only one in the world that can do this, is not granted an export license to China. Now the result of this is already visible, because the prediction was that around 2027, 29, something like that bracket, China would become the first economy in the world. Now it moved to 33, 35, something like that. And that is important for the US, but also important for us, because then you can probably build factories like that in your own area, in your own part of the world. This is, of course, strange enough linked to this, because what happened at the start of the war, no, before the start of the war, maybe you remember that, there was an agreement between Presidents Xi and Putin at the start of the Olympic Games. And in a way, this agreement was a kind of a non-aggression treaty, meaning that President Xi could do his thing in Asia, and he would not bother what Putin did in Europe. So there was really an agreement on geopolitics, and together, and that was the objective, and you can read it in the 5,000 words they put on paper. The objective was to change the unipolar world in their view and replace it by a multipolar world where China and Russia would play a more important role in international politics. So this is completely linked to the rise of China. Before 2014, when the Crimea was, the annexation of the Crimea took place, before that year, there was not really a desire to gamble on it in Russia. In those days, there were, let's say, around 2010, there was still the perception that the West was still number one. It was militarily extremely strong, and that you really should, if you make a cost-benefit calculus, that you really should not attack parts of Ukraine. But after that, it started to change. And that is linked to the rise of China and the decline, the relative decline of the West. We're still strong, but it's a relative decline vis-à-vis China. So what you see is that countries, because of this global power shift, were capable of doing some military adventurism. they could take more room to maneuver in foreign policies, could easily use their military in order to, correct historical deficiencies. That's exactly what happened here. So it was a predicted conflict. The problem, and that was, in my view, a good assessment of President Putin, is we had in this part of the world 30 years of strategic neglect. Let's face it, we abolished most of our armed forces. Typical ideas, typical concept of coercive diplomacy, no one knew it anymore. Security in foreign policy didn't really play a role. It was about human security, but not about territorial integrity. So it all started to change. A year ago, I was for the last time in Moscow, and I heard President Putin, Minister Lavrov, Shoigu, Gerasimov, let's say the whole top leadership, they all had the same narrative. It was all about the decadence of the West and the easiness with which you could carry out an intervention because they would not react. It was just a decadent part of the world, and there was absolutely no desire anymore to defend our own country. And remember what happened around that time. That was the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and this contributed to this image of a weakened West that was not able and not capable anymore to defend itself, and even they could not defend their interest in Kabul. So they had to go. That had a huge impact. So what we see here is that there was a gamble to do this. Now, how to do it, and what the consequences are, we could, for example, from a military perspective, discuss during the question and answer period. But what we see now is really amazing. It's sheer incompetence, in my view, from the Russian side. We were quite amazed, first of all, that he carried out the attack with 150,000 troops. Because in practice then you can deploy only 50,000 troops, so that is really nothing in a country bigger than France and 44 million inhabitants. It was a strange thing. They were quite successful in the south, by the way, because there the shock and awe strategy, the rapid deployment of units really worked. But after a while, Ukraine managed to stop that. And what we now see is something that was really unimaginable, let's say, half a year ago, is that Ukraine might very well win this war. We're not sure, of course, we can't predict, but there is a possibility that this will happen. And it is really quite remarkable. Fighting against the second army in the world and then winning is quite remarkable. So what we do, and I started my talk with this key message about autocracies, especially responsible for the export of raw materials, oil and gas to Europe. We portrayed this, at least President Biden started doing this, as a democracy versus autocracy war. And I was not really happy with that. Because I knew, of course, and my whole team at HCSS, my think tank, knew that we were completely dependent on autocracies for the exports or the imports of raw materials and energy. So don't do it, because it will go at the expense of your own bargaining position. Talk about like-minded countries. That's much better. So, and especially after President Biden went first to Venezuela in order to have a deal on oil, because the output of oil had to rise, so he had to go to Venezuela, but it is really a country that is sanctioned by the US in an incredible way. And then he went to Saudi Arabia, and you know what happened. There was an agreement that the OPEC would pump up more oil, but OPEC Plus, including Russia, said, okay, we're not going to do that. And that also contributed to the high oil prices. And that explains that those countries now start to see how they could put pressure on the West, including the US. So we became a kind of backers, including, interestingly enough, President Biden. So we started with sanctions. I'm absolutely in favor of sanctions, no doubt about it. But the problem is, of course, that the sanctions now have turned into a kind of economic warfare, which has huge implications for our economies. And I will come back to the energy issue later on, because technically speaking, the Repower EU proposal, 2/3 less gas at the end of the year and 1/3 we need, that proposal is not technically a sanction. The boycott that will start at the 5th of December is. But I will come back to that, because that is really, really important. All the rest of the sanctions I'm okay with, but here I have my doubts. So what we see, again, and that's now clear, I think, by now, is that dependencies are under attack. The Americans, President Biden, already before the war, said, look, we are too dependent on critical raw materials, especially for the fabrication of chips, of semiconductors. So we have to do something. So he asked the industry to look for alternatives, and that's not easy, I can assure you. And I will come back to that later too, and then you can see how difficult it is. So what you see is that, for example, the US imported 90% of the semiconductor grade neon from Ukraine. Neon is a byproduct of the steel industry. It was purified in Ukraine, and then it was exported to the US, Europe, Taiwan, whatever. So that has stopped now. Palladium, you really need that to produce chips. 35% came from Russia. So that is a problem too. And here is also a connection with the war in China. Russia buys 70% of its semiconductors in China, but the sanctions on semiconductors really hit China hard, so the export to Russia is also very difficult. So it's all interconnected right now. And then, of course, we have SWIFT, the banking system that is not allowed anymore to use the SWIFT system. Steel, fertilizers, food are used as weapons, etc. What about the European Union? So, not NATO in this respect, but the European Union. NATO plays a very important role, but the arms deliveries is, what is it, 80% US. So we now clearly face the problem, have to face the problems we created over the last couple of decades, and we simply do not have the capabilities anymore to export weapons in sufficient quantities to Ukraine. The Americans do, but they have a problem now with the number of artillery pieces and the rounds for artillery to produce that. So they have now a huge industrial capacity problem. But nevertheless, the EU as a geopolitical player is quite interesting, because what we see, and that was also predicted, of course, by Monnet and Schuman, so that was at the start of the whole process of European integration after the end of the Second World War, is that every time we have a crisis, the European Union integrates further. So the financial crisis 10 years ago led to a strengthening of the banking sector. COVID-19, I will not go to everything, and you can't read it in the back. COVID-19 was a turning point. The most important one, in my view, was the idea to have this have common loans in order to have this restructuring fund of 750 billion euros, and here we cross the line to Eurobonds, and that is something that the Dutch didn't like, but we couldn't make our point anymore because of the Brexit. And the Brits didn't want it as well, but this was a direct consequence, in my view, of the Brexit. So we have crossed this line, and this has huge implication, of course, for the euro and also for EU taxes. You have to pay back your loans, and you can do that now also by EU taxes. Very interesting one, and President Trump was also responsible for this one. We try to have open strategic autonomy. I don't think I need to explain what it is, but the problem is you cannot have open strategic autonomy if you don't have access to oil, gas, and other commodities. So you need that. And that is, of course, the big issue here. And this problem, because of the war, and because China is a systemic rival, has only got worse over the last couple of months. The Ukraine war itself is also quite interesting, because all of a sudden the European Union now is a kind of military player. You can buy things on the market, and then you can send a receipt to Brussels, and you're reimbursed. And that is really something that is completely new. And I really hope that this is the start of a discussion on real European capabilities, and also European command capabilities, because we don't have that. We simply cannot command our own troops. That is impossible without the Americans, and we simply do not know what the Americans will do in the future. God knows who will be the next president of the US. If it's Trump, we have a problem. Because if the commander-in-chief of the armed forces does not want to deploy its armed forces in favor of or in the defense of Europe, then we really have a problem. So we must come up with something. We must have our own capabilities. But also this war makes clear that the biggest priority for the Americans is still China and not Russia. And that is also something we should not forget. The classified national defense strategy was just published, and some parts of it were declassified, and it's absolutely clear. This is what the Americans say. China is a systemic rival, Russia not, and we should avoid war with Russia at all costs. Do then the sanctions work? Well, if you are familiar with the sanctions literature, then you have to acknowledge that it has never happened that military adventurism was stopped because of sanctions. It simply never happened. And there is a lot of sanctions literature around. You simply cannot do that. Look, for example, at North Korea. I don't need to explain what this country is. It's a kind of open-air communist museum. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, and it's the most sanctioned countries in the world, and yet it is capable to develop intercontinental missiles with nuclear weapons on it, and they are capable of destroying cities in the US. This is what you can do as a poor country. Now, Russia is completely different, so you simply cannot stop a war with that. And again, I'm not absolutely not against sanctions. I'm very much in favor of it, but you always should think about the objectives, the goals you want to achieve with sanctions. The goal explained by, for example, the European Commission, and applauded by all the leaders of the European Union countries, is quite simple. All Russians should leave Ukraine. And you simply cannot do that with sanctions, unfortunately. If you look at the sanctions literature, then these are the common mistakes. They are hastily imposed. This is also the case here. They're quickly imposed to make a strong statement to the rest of the world. We do something, and that's good. I'm not against it. But if you don't think about it properly, then you really make mistakes, and then it will hurt you even more than it will hurt the others. Also, a mistake that leads to failed sanctions is maximalist demands. This is a maximalist demand, but usually that doesn't work. Zero. In zero cases it has worked. It also doesn't work if circumvention is possible. We all know that oil is being sold for cheaper prices, I know it, to other parts of the world, Iran, India, China. Gas is difficult. Or, and then I will stop with this slide, the cost for the sender are high. The costs for us are extremely high because this is not sanctions anymore, this is economic warfare. And the costs are so high that we now have to come up with all kinds of measures like price caps and subsidies in order to be sure that we do not have political and social problems in our own country. So that is something that should never happen when you impose sanctions, by the way. Moreover, if you want to stop a war, then you should do that with military means. And if you don't have the military means, then you are in trouble. In this case, America takes over. What you see, and that was something that in my view was not taken sufficiently into account, is that the adversary, Russia in this case, but the same also of course for China, can also use counter-sanctions. For example, the sanctions imposed on Russia during after the annexation of the Crimea had the effect that Russia focused on its own food production and all of a sudden became the most important grain trader in the world. That is not something, before that it was only weapons, oil and gas. And now all of a sudden it was also grain. And you see what's happening right now. Ukraine is also a very important one. And you see now that food can be used as a weapon quite easily. And this is linked, of course, to fertilizers. You have three kinds of fertilizers: nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. Potassium is exported by Belarus and Russia, and there's an embargo, so we can't get it anymore, at least not in sufficient quantities. Nitrogen is made of gas. Well, don't need to explain that this is a problem. And then we have phosphate, and that is from Morocco. And also here, I already hear, well, that's not a nice country too. Well, it doesn't matter. That's the only one who can deliver now in sufficient quantities phosphate for the European market. Food, I just mentioned it. 30% of the world's wheat production is Ukraine and Russia, 20% of the world's maize production, and 80% of the world's sunflower oil production. There is not an absolute shortage in the world. Even if you block the two countries completely and they don't export anymore, we don't have a shortage. The problem is that we have a price crisis. The same was true for oil and gas, by the way. So there are no shortages, but there are disruptions, and the disruptions they matter. But an adversary knows it, so you can manipulate with with flows. In this case, with food, and of course this will increase the problem by the fertilizer problem. But we also face a problem of countercoercion in the field of energy, and here we have a real problem. When the announcement was made of Repower EU, it was in March, I think. I was really amazed, to be honest, because 2/3 we would reduce the inflow of gas by 2/3 before the end of the war, and 1/3 we needed for the winter. What would you then expect that Putin would do? Rob, don't worry, he needs the money. So the gas will come. No. Russia is a country with usually a very good financial management. They have reserves. They boast about their reserves. It's smaller than what they have, and of course the sanctions hit hard. But think about North Korea. So Putin really could stop the flow of gas without too many difficulties for his own country. And I said, look, if this happens, I said it on television, but I said it also internally, first usually internally and then in the media. What would I do? I always think, what would I do in such a case? Then I would manipulate the flow of gas and I would say, I have technical problems. And that happened. I also thought about bombing or whatever, explosions in the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, and it happened. So my team, we probably is filled with bad people, but we could easily come up with all kinds of countermeasures. And we had a list of 10, and we're now at number 3. So you can go on forever with countercoercion. And the problem is, of course, huge. I don't need to explain it to you, that the fear of cold winters and the fear of an economic downturn is immense in Europe, and it's happening right now. So this is something we really had to take into account. So what you do if you read the sanctions literature carefully, then you have two options. You could either say to Putin, look, we will block the oil and gas flow now completely, and we take the hit. That is something you can do. What you also can do is say, if you start manipulating the flow of oil and gas, new sanctions will be imposed. That is normally what you do. But if you are really angry, then you can say, look, we stop the imports altogether now, and we take the hit. That is something you could, but not this. What we now did was really contrary to all the experience with sanctions we had over the last couple of years. Now, this is one you simply can't read, but that doesn't matter. This is, to make matters worse, it is about semiconductors. And in order to explain how vulnerable we are. So we are vulnerable for the import of oil and gas, raw materials, but semiconductors is really a disaster. Look, but it's quite easy to explain. This is where the mines of semiconductors are. Not of semiconductors, I wish it was true, of raw materials are palladium, gallium, germanium, rare earth elements. There's only 3 countries. The Democratic Republic of Congo, which is not that democratic, by the way. That is cobalt, for example. The cobalt mines are owned by China. The refinery takes place in China. Then you move to China. That is one of the most important exporters of rare earth elements. Then there is another country, Russia, and that exports palladium, among other things, neon, palladium, things like that. So the critical raw materials for producing semiconductors is in those 3 countries. And we don't have a very good relationship with those countries right now, don't we? This is where the tooling is made. For example, this major company ASML in the Netherlands is here, but also some American companies and some Chinese companies, they produce the tooling, but you can't produce the tooling if here, and that is Europe, America, but especially Taiwan, if you don't receive the raw materials anymore from those 3 countries, you simply cannot produce your chips anymore, your semiconductors anymore. And then if this is the case, then then it's useless to produce those machines at the center. So we really have a big problem here. And that brings me back to Taiwan. Taiwan is really crucial here. But also the war the Ukraine war has really disrupted all the supply chains, the global supply chains, for example, of semiconductors, which is at the heart, what I said in the beginning, of this industrial revolution. So what's going on here is that flow security becomes immensely important. What happens in Ukraine is, in a way, 19th century. if you really want to hurt a country, and that is now a by-effect of the Ukraine war, is you attack the flows, the international supply chains. And the flows could be anything, from goods, raw materials, energy, food, services, ideas, data. That is the reason data why President Trump started to attack the 5G business of Huawei, the Chinese company. You can attack money, SWIFT, the banking messaging system. And you can, this is what China does, this is what the US does, this is what Russia does, and this is what the European Union also does. And this is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is only about, so the new Silk routes, that is only about flow security. Goods flow through the air, through the digital infrastructure, by sea, from one part of the world to another part of the world. So this is being attacked right now. And we really see the consequence of the Belt and Road Initiative, because there is now a tendency to reduce the activities in Europe because of all the attacks on the Chinese flows. So this has huge implications. So this is really geopolitics that's at work, and that is about the flows of goods. Talking about the flows of goods, and talking about flows in general, we can have a discussion in a minute on what the outcome of the conflict is. But personally, if you ask me, I don't see no other short-term solution but to have a new Iron Curtain in Europe. I don't like it. Last year it was quite interesting. Shogui, at least, don't think that Shogui speaks English, but so his advisor asked me, look, the minister wants you to discuss Yalta 2.0. You know, that's about buffer zones. We need buffer zones in Europe. Oh yes, I'm willing to say something about that, but you won't like it. Because we believe in this part of the world, in my part of the world, that every country has the right to choose its own allies, its political system, its economic system. So we are not going to say, look, you will be part of a buffer zone. But I'm perfectly happy to explain it to this audience. And I said, and Sjoeke said, no. And after a while he said, okay, do it. That was fun, because the president of the OSCE was also there, and he had exactly the same arguments as I had. So that I was not alone then. But what we see now is that the relationship is really destroyed. I don't need to explain it to you. So we will have a new Iron Curtain. And the interesting thing is, this is the old one, of course, and now it moved a couple of 100 kilometers to the east. We will have a new Iron Curtain here because of the admission of Sweden and Finland to NATO. And then it goes down. And then the big question is, of course, Ukraine. What is it? How are we going to deal with Ukraine? On which side of the Iron Curtain will be Ukraine? And how are we going to formalize it? That will be, in my view, if you talk about European security, one of the most intriguing questions. And there is really a problem here, because if you look at the way the West is now supporting Ukraine, especially with weapons, there are shortages now. So we have no other choice but in a while, in a couple of months, one and a half year maximum, to move from the supply of weapons and ammunition to deterrence. And deterrence is about nuclear weapons and about security guarantees. This is exactly what Zelensky wants. And how are you going to organize deterrence? And deterrence is about nuclear weapons. You simply don't have that many choices anymore. So sooner or later, we will have a discussion whether Ukraine should become member of NATO. Now, if this happens, especially in the context also of the two Nordic states, then this is a blow for Putin beyond belief. But we will have a discussion on that, in my view, maybe sooner than later. And also today in Bucharest, the Secretary General of NATO has said, look, the door remains open. Yeah, true. But at the same time, when will this happen? And probably we'll have a discussion on this sooner than later. And the reason is, again, we have to move from defense providing weapons to deterrence. And that has huge, huge implications. And then after a while, if Putin disappeared, then you can have a discussion on a real European security order again. So what happens is that this perfectly reflects into a trend that is also visible for quite a few years now. That is geopolitical blocks. So don't look at the colors, it simply doesn't matter. But you have one block, China, linked to other parts of the world through the Belt and Road Initiative. Then you have Russia, linked through all kinds of institutional arrangements to the former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan in the south. Then you have the EU and you have US. Now, under Trump, this didn't went very well. Now we have a fairly good connection, but what we see right now with the new initiative of President Biden, the $4 billion Inflation Reduction Initiative, that will have huge consequences. And I see already a mild panic in Brussels because this will completely weaken our position vis-à-vis the US. The competition will be really fierce, and we already see discussions within companies saying, look, we have to move to the US because it will be cheaper there. BASF is a very important example here. So we simply do not know what happens here. So it's not, there is no guarantee that the Western Bloc will remain one. I really hope so, but hope is not a strategy. Russia, the whole thing is crumbling apart. If you look what Kazakhstan is doing, Uzbekistan, they don't like the war. China is in trouble. Yes, we see new geopolitical blocks, but we simply do not know how it works out in the future. What we do know is that flow security and the flow among the blocks is really problematic in the future. So we see it, for example, already on the internet. The internet is fragmented. There is no World Wide Web anymore. If you go to China or to Russia, it's almost impossible, for example, to read Dutch newspaper or Luxembourg newspapers in Moscow or in Beijing. So it's already fragmented. So we really see a splintering of international relations here. And then the big question is what will happen with Africa and South America. This is no problem, of course, but this really is a challenge, except the Southern Hemisphere is a challenge, except, of course, for Australia. So what we do right now is focusing on like-minded countries. And we produced this one for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't know if it was when you were minister in the Netherlands when we did this. I think so, yes, I think you're absolutely right. So it's a couple of years old, but it really gives you a good idea what you can do. Blue is more or less like-minded. This United States, Germany, France, United Kingdom, from the position of the Netherlands, but you can easily say this also from the position, in my view, of Luxembourg and Belgium, this is our natural allies. Then we have a couple of countries we call the associates. They are also pretty good. Poland, Austria, we may have some difficulties with some other countries, but let's say the European Union is not a problem. Then you move to the prospects, countries that are yes or no like-minded countries. India is a very interesting example, but also Brazil. We had a regime change, elections in Brazil, and all of a sudden we can again do business with Brazil in a completely different way. The problem is, of course, here, is the yellow ones, and those countries are usually the suppliers of raw materials, not here. This is not the suppliers of raw materials or energy. That comes from here, and they are contradictors. They want to change the system, including Russia. And a real disruptor is China. You could say that Russia is a disruptor as well, but a systemic rival is China because it's so big. So what we see here is that like-minded countries are usually not, there are quite a few, but like-minded countries are usually not the countries that have the raw materials and the energy. So you have to do business with a couple of countries you may or may not like. So the conclusion. The world is really changing. Well, I think that is clear by now. Everybody can see it. If you read the papers, then it's absolutely clear. Blocks, spheres of influence, international politics, international relations will be more transactional, zero-sum. You have to lose, I have to gain, if you want it or not. So it's a rough world out there. Mercantilism, my economy first, flow security, high on the agenda. And the problem of the European Union is not outside pressure. Because I wrote a book called The Battle for Europe, it was unfortunately is now being translated. I was really amazed how strong the European Union as a geopolitical player is. If you look, for example, what the European Union does with the exclusive competences of Brussels, then you understand why when you travel to Beijing or to Moscow, there is always, the European Union is respected as a power player. If you ask in my country, how unified is the European Union and is it really a geopolitical player? No, it's a big mess. Have you ever seen what happened in the Netherlands Parliament? So it's not that difficult, but this is how democracy works. It's messy. But the problem is that if you, and I heard Xi Jinping that say during the 17th anniversary, when I was there in China, and they admire the European Union because they see it as a bloc, and that is because of the competences of Brussels, trade policies, for example. They all want a trade agreement, and you don't get it. They all want access to the European integrated market. So yes, the European Union will not collapse because of outside pressure. It can collapse by inside pressure, that's for sure. And President Putin knows this. And this is exactly what he's doing right now. So that is my biggest worry right now. Yeah, well, and then adaptation is of course key. If you represent, for example, a business, a factory or whatever, industry, then start doing geopolitical due diligence. Think about those things. Look how, for example, blocks and reduced flows could affect your business. That is something we have to do. That is also something we do for the Dutch government. We do it all the time. And now there is a general understanding that indeed there is something going on and that we have to adapt. And well, I think that is probably the only good thing of this war. And that is that we start to understand that something is really changing in the world and that we have to adapt. And I'm not that negative because democracies really can adapt. We can adapt. We have an intellectual basis to do this. So I'm not that negative, although the analysis is quite negative. Thank you very much.
So first I want to thank the Dutch Embassy and also Luxembourg Times and the University of Luxembourg for organizing this conference and discussion today, because what Professor Wiegand, thank you for your really for your speech and for your demonstration today, was that because you presented key elements of what should and must be the discussion in the world and especially in Europe at this moment. And I have done some notices. I would really underline 3 points that I took out of what you have described now during the last hour. The first one is that a value-driven, ethical foreign affair policy, and I would even say not only foreign affair, but also economic policy, is key for Europe, but that does not mean that it should be, on one hand, naive, or on the other hand, opportunistic. Naive, we were after 1989, because we thought in Europe that after the fall of the Curtain Wall, that the one that you described, Europe would be safe. We would not have to invest, for example, more in our common security. We could rely on the United States, and that would be enough to guarantee our security. It was completely naive what we did in 1989. Even for me, one of the highlights of this naivete was the speech of Putin in the German Bundestag, when the whole Bundestag really applauded him. And that was not so long ago. So that was, if I remember well, in 2008 or 2009, was it something around this? So that was really the high point of our naivete. And the second point is opportunistic. Opportunistic we were from 2010 on, because after 2010, Putin showed already very well what would be his strategy. At least, at minimum, in 2014, when he occupied Crimea, it was clear what was the plan of Mr. Putin and his government, or so-called government. And the United States already was very much aware in 2014 about this, and really tried to push Europe to do more for its defense, but we didn't saw it. We wanted to see it because we were so dependent of especially some raw materials, and especially in the energy sector of oil and gas. And that brings me to my second point, which is what you described also very well. What are the drivers today of the conflicts that we have in the world? And the drivers are mainly our dependence especially energy, and also raw materials in general. And in the energy sector, it's really crazy, because first of all, we know already for decades what could be the alternatives to make us more energy independent in Europe. And I'm speaking naturally about renewable energies, for example. But not only renewable energies as a resource, as an energy resource, but also the technologies that we can use today to really produce, for example, electricity or energy in general in Europe, taking in account more the renewable energies. The technologies which are, for example, solar panels or batteries, really new technologies that had been invented in Europe. But what we did, we invented it, and we gave the technology to China. And now China is producing the solar panels and the batteries and really exporting them back to Europe. So we have no factories in Europe, or nearly no factories that can produce this. And that's our second problem. It's not only dependency from raw materials, also energy, but also from the fabrication, the industrialization. We desindustrialized Europe, because many industries prefer to go to China and produce from there, and that's even also the case for the United States, because you talked about Taiwan. You are right that the semiconductors are really invented, and really the brain of the semiconductor is in Taiwan. But also Taiwan invested billions of dollars to mainland China. What is Foxconn? Foxconn is the main factory in mainland China that is producing the semiconductors for the iPhones, or the chips for the iPhones, whatever. And today, the interruption that we have in the production chains are coming because China has a problem, and you described it, the problems that they have at the moment, but even the United States is dependent from China, even in the production line. So not even that we gave over the technologies to them, and we are dependent from their raw materials, but also the production chains we really put in there. Today, if you look at Germany, why does Germany have so many difficulties to be more critical, for example, regarding the policy of China? 50% of the German cars today are sold in China, not in Europe. 50%. So they are completely dependent, economically dependent from China. And that's the second point. We really have to bring back the industry in Europe, to Europe, and produce. I don't look at during the COVID period, pharmaceutical products. From where are coming our pharmaceutical products? From India or China? We don't produce them anymore in Europe, and it's crazy, but we invented them all. So that's the second point. And the third point is unity and building up a unit in Europe. We have now a common market, but we have a common money. It's good. We did a lot of things in the last 20, 30 years in Europe to build up a really strong European Union. And I'm still believing that the European Union model, not only because of its values, but also because of the power that it has. The European Union, it's at the moment nearly 500 million consumers with the highest per habitant income in an internal market in the world. That's the difference. In China, you have 1.4 billion people living there. We have nearly 500 million. But if you look at the income per habitant in Europe, it's much higher. So China does not only need Europe because of technology, but also because we are an interesting market for them. Because they want to export their goods at the end of the day also to China. So Europe, building up Europe, but that means also giving up national sovereignty, and there is the biggest problem. If you look at what is happening in the defense sector, we now adopted a new strategic compass at the last 6 months ago at the Defense and Foreign Affairs Ministers' Council. It's good. The paper is good, but it's a paper. If you look only one point, the creation of the European battle group that we have decided. Yes, it's okay to create a battle group. That's the first point. Creating a battle group with 5,000 soldiers, at the end of the day, it will not be enough. You have to go one day to 10, 15, 20,000, I don't know. But the main problem is who will have the command of this battle group? Second point is how do you buy your material, your posture, how do you build up your military deterrence that you have to build up in Europe? Is it like today? The United States, they have, for example, if you look at, I was in Hamburg last week, and that we had a discussion there also, and then we discussed about delivering tanks to Ukraine. So then the question was, what will we deliver, the German Leopard or the Abraham from United States? I said, yeah, for the United States, it's simple. They have one model. We have 10 models in Europe. And we have 10 different industries in Europe. And they don't work together, but they're working one against another. So in the future, a common European defense policy would also mean pooling and sharing, trying to really build up a common deterrence program and really then also buy it together. So making Europe strong by giving up more national sovereignty and give it to the European Union level. It's a key element if we want to succeed. Thank you.
Minister Basch, thank you very much. Can I just maybe follow up on that? Because Professor de Wijk mentioned the famous Jean Monnet quote that Europe grows through crisis. And we have in the past with the financial crisis, with the health crisis. Do you think we're going to a similar crisis that will enable that, the emergence of a common defense policy in Europe?
Yes, I'm much more optimistic today than I was 2 years ago, but that already starts with the Afghanistan catastrophe, the chaos that had been produced in Afghanistan. If you look at the evacuation of our population or our soldiers from Afghanistan. Without the United States, we would have been lost. We would have. Who else than the United States would be able to secure this airport with 6,000 GIs in such a short period of time and so efficiently? Europe would not be capable. If the same situation would happen in the Sahel zone, where Europe is alone active and not with the United States, what would be the result? France maybe could provide us, but even look at what happened to France in Mali, it's not a good example. So we have to build up, and I'm optimistic. I can assure you that what I can feel inside the Defense Council and also inside of NATO, there is an enormous change in the mindset after Afghanistan and now also after Ukraine. And where the risks are, that's inside of Europe. Can we keep the population on this coast? That's another question.
Yeah, I know when I look at the audience that there will be a contribution from the audience that might be almost as interesting as what you two have just told us. But I want to ask one very quick question to Professor de Wijk. If you draw that fascinating picture of the Iron Curtain across Europe and how it's shifting, so if you picture us in this room in 5 years' time, where do you think that, well, will the war be over in Ukraine by then, and where is the Iron Curtain going to be in 2027?
Yeah, I really sincerely hope that the war will be over by then. It's so remarkable what's happening. So it could be over in 2 months, but it also could last 5 years. We simply do not know, because this is not a normal war in a way. That is because of what I explained earlier, due to the incompetence of the way the Russians fight this war. So it is very hard to predict. It's like a football match. It's also, you can explain what's happening there, but I'm not a football expert, but you can explain what's happening there, but you cannot explain the outcome of the match. And it is exactly what we see right now here too. But I cannot. Well, we will have an Iron Curtain if there is not a complete collapse in the Russian establishment. If Putin does not disappear, or Putin is replaced by a like-minded person, and there is a highly chance that if he disappears, that this will happen, because otherwise the whole thing will collapse. So this is a kleptocracy. So everybody is dependent on each other. So you really need to hold each other tight. Otherwise, the whole country will collapse. So that is highly likely that this will not happen. And then there is no basis for for any agreement or any discussion about the European security order based on cooperative security. So then I come to the conclusion that the only possibility is that we will have a new Iron Curtain like the one we had in during the Cold War, and then after a while you have a discussion on security building measures, cooperative security, things like that, and you have an exchange of views. But yes, then the big question is, of course, where will it start? That is not that difficult where it will start. It will start in Norway, north of Norway. Then it will go down Finland, Baltic states. Then we don't know what will happen. Is it including Moldova and Ukraine? We will have a discussion on that if we want it or not.
And Belarus.
And Belarus, yeah. Then it goes down. Then, of course, there's the traditional NATO members, Bulgaria, etc., Romania. And then it will be exciting to know what will happen then with Turkey and Georgia. We simply do not know right now. So there are quite a few loose ends. But something like this will happen, in my view. I think that at least there is a high likelihood that this will happen. But it remains to be seen how it works out. And then the big question is indeed, on what side of the Iron Curtain is Ukraine? That is really, or is it a hole in the Iron Curtain? That is also a possibility.
And are you equally optimistic about European common defense policy as Minister Buys?
I think we have no choice. And the reason is also that we start to understand, and I think that this, I mentioned this, those declassified parts of the classified national defense strategy, where the US says, look, for us, China is a systemic rival, not Russia. So we have to act, and we have to change. We have no choice. And I think here the ship has hit a rock, and you have to turn, if you want it or not. But I think we are here more or less on the same line.
Excellent. I want to give the people in the audience a chance to ask you questions. Already see several hands going up. A lady here in front. There is a microphone on its way. So,
thank you so much, Professor de Vries. It was a great pleasure to listen to you. You said that in the first part of your speech that sanctions made by the European Union were not optimal because they have side effects. The European Union knew when they initiated those sanctions that there would be side effects, of course, although nobody expected that those side effects would be so huge. Those sanctions were based on something that is very dear to us, the values, the universal values, and l'état de droit, the state of law. If we had not done those sanctions based on these values, Europe would have fallen apart. We had no choice, in my opinion. Maybe the modulation could have been different, or the endpoints, but we had no choice. And one effect is that Europe has become stronger, because there has been a better integration from a political point of view, defense point of view, health point of view, information point of view, communication point of view, and it's not over. So, and for instance, the fact that Finland and Sweden want to join NATO is also a consequence of these values. So what would you have done? I thought I understood that you had better proposals. I don't want to offend you, but that's what I thought I would understand.
No,
Please, what would you have done?
I understand your question. No, what I said, I'm not against sanctions. Absolutely not. I'm in favor of all the sanction packages that were introduced. No doubt about it. You have to do it. The problem, however, is if you introduce measures that will hurt you more than the adversary, then you are in trouble. And we know that from all the sanctions research that has been done over the last couple of decades. This has always been the case. First, the assumption, and that is also very important, is assumption when people think, when politicians think in this case, that you can get rid of all the Russians from Ukrainian soil. That is impossible with sanctions. You can only do that with military force. That's the only thing you can do. And you must be very, very careful that you do not impose measures, and the Repower EU is not a sanction but a measure that will hurt you more than the adversary, because then you run a risk that in the end the whole European Union will fall apart. And that is really a big problem. And that is what worries me. So I'm in favor of all the sanctions, all the packages, except this one.
So, and you said in the end we will have to be deterrent, but how should we do it? Because we have given all our weapons to Ukraine. All stocks in Europe have been lessened very much. We cannot replace them from one day to another.
That's a big problem. And the same also, by the way, for the US. And so most people don't believe that, but it's a very, very simple example. Do you know how many artillery rounds Ukraine fires per day? Any idea?
No.
Yeah, 6,000 or 7,000. Do you know what the production, the monthly production of artillery rounds is in the US? 15,000. It's 2 days. This is really a big problem. So 1 million is nothing. And you can easily make a calculation how long it will last. And the production is not easy. So you simply cannot ramp up the production in the US. The same holds true for Europe. You simply cannot do that. What we now see is that you have to refurbish the artillery pieces. And how are we going to do that? It's done in Poland. You should do it in Ukraine, because logistically that is better. But who is going to do that? It's done, but it is really problematic. We never thought about, also not the Americans, about a war of attrition, of a long war, a war where so many artillery rounds are fired and so many missiles have been launched. That is, and so many drones have been used. That was not in the books, and now we have to pay the price for it. That's what it is. So this is such a war is a contest of will, and here the Ukrainians have a huge advantage, but it's also context of logistics. And here I don't know. I simply don't know. I simply cannot predict who can outlast this and who has the production capacity to do this. We, the West, including the US, have huge problems here. We can do something, that's for sure. But you simply cannot produce within 6 or 7 months a complete new array of weapon system. That is simply not possible. And here we really have a problem, and it's unpredictable how it works out. You would like to say something about it?
I agree on this, but really the same situation is for Russia. So even they cannot produce eternally
probably
rockets.
they're better off, but you're right.
But that's why many strategists and analysts now, they fear that we go in what you call a frozen war. So you have to, so that's what happened in the Korean War in the 50s, for example. So you have two sides and nobody advances anymore, and then this war can take 1, 2, 3, 4 years. So and that cannot, but it will be very difficult also for Ukraine to really advance and really gaining again terrain like they did it now the last weeks.
Yeah, I completely agree, because so the most likely outcome, I think here we agree, but that is also quite controversial in a way. I don't know how it is in this country, but in other countries it's quite controversial because people believe that Ukraine is winning. That is not entirely the case, unfortunately. So a frozen conflict is most likely. Then you have a ceasefire, but no peace agreement. And the example of North and South Korea is excellent, because 70 years ago there was a peace agreement, but a ceasefire, but no peace agreement. And it's still a frozen conflict. And it's a similar situation in a way as we have in Transnistria, in Moldova, or in the republics surrounding in the neighborhood of Georgia. Georgia is the same, yeah, and it's now developing also in Syria, where also Russians are involved. It's a speciality. Frozen conflicts is a typical Russian speciality.
More questions from the audience? I see a hand there, right in the back.
Thank you. I'm just wondering whether there could be some comments about Boris Johnson's comment about a week ago that in February, both Germany and France were more than hesitant to abandon a stance of neutrality. Would that have been because of traditional anti-Americanism in the case of France, because of the feeling that they've got a fifth column in the country in the case of Germany, with all the Russian propaganda, political interference by Russia in the case of Le Pen in France, of the possibly AfD in Germany? What were the motives, and what did the US have to do to convince these two countries to align themselves with the US approach to Ukraine? Was that talking to reason? Was it political pressure, or was it blackmail?
Honestly, making a comment about Mr. Boris Johnson, I must make a little bit yoga before I doing the comment. So, but you must see when the war starts. First of all, nobody believed, and there the United States had an advantage. They were sure long months ago, before Europe understood that Russia would attack Ukraine. The Europeans believed until the last day that it would not happen. Even in my country, even in the government, even myself, I must be honest, even until end of February, I always thought in the last minute we will have a negotiated solution. And then the war came, but I must say that very quickly, very fast, the mentality changed in Europe. And it has had nothing to do that the United States had to do pressure or anybody, certainly not Mr. Boris Johnson. No? He had enough to do in his own country with his personal situation, I think. So I think that the sensibilization came with the act of Russia going into Ukraine. And very fast, the mentality changed. If you look at Germany today, with their history on the back. It's not nothing, the last century. And what had been decided in Germany, or what had been discussed in Germany, I would say 2, 3, 4 years. I'm coming from the Green Party. I know the history of the Green Party. Look at the positions of the Green Party in the German government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs today, and compare this of what, for example, the Greens in Germany said years ago. It's completely different. They changed, and they changed with what happened. And that's very often the case. If an historical moment happens, the mentality is changing also. So today, Europe is united more than ever about what is to do to really deliver to Ukraine and to really support Ukraine. And we did not need Boris Johnson to do this.
It's also linked to the question what happened at the start of the war. I belong also to the people who said, well, he's not going to attack because 150,000 soldiers to occupy a country, that is simply not possible. Then I said it on television, and then someone from NATO called me the other day, and he said, look, Rob, I saw you saying that, but trust me, he's going to attack. I said, look, but if he's going to attack, that is nonsense. You can't win. You cannot, if you're not willing to mobilize, for example, if it is a limited military operation or special military operation, as it was called, then why on earth are you going to do that? And how can you have some success? That is exactly our analysis as well. But trust me, he's going to do it. So I thought, like many other people, that this is a typical case of coercive diplomacy. So coercive diplomacy is you threaten with military force, and then you say, look, you should not become a member of NATO, but you should become neutral. Now the interesting thing is, but we will find out sooner or later, is that there was a agreement in the early days, even before the start of the war between Russia and Ukraine, that indeed the country would become neutral, and it would allow, in a way, or it was willing to discuss. I don't know exactly how it was put on paper because I haven't seen it, but the country was willing to discuss, let's say, the status of the two so-called People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk and the Crimea, especially the republics in the Donbass. This was interesting. It is quite interesting. It was blocked by Putin, so there was an agreement. And we also know who broke this agreement, but it was blocked by Putin. And no one understood why. He simply wanted to have war. And that also puts the whole discussion on neutrality in a completely different light. And then we had all the negotiations, also taking place in Turkey, a 10-point plan that was an extension of the plan I just mentioned. We don't know, at least I don't know, what happened also behind the scenes and what role the Americans and the Brits played. Because the Americans and Brits, they trained and equipped the Ukrainian armed forces as of 2015, so after the Crimea War. So they had a big say, a really big say in the internal affairs of Ukraine. And I know personally a couple of people who are still having a very big say on it and are very close advisors to the government. And so, no answer, but this is something we really have to look at.
I think there's time for one or two more questions. Gentleman at the back there.
Thank you very much. And also a big thanks, Mr. de Wijk, for your constant effort since the start of this war by providing a daily podcast. It's really highly appreciated. Following the logic from this podcast, Putin's position, and you touched upon it just before, is stable as long as he doesn't lose. He doesn't need to win, but he shouldn't lose. Now, of course, he's losing at this very moment. Now, we've seen the oligarchs distancing themselves a little bit from Putin, and I'm not at all putting my faith in Russian civil society, but it always helps if you want to topple a dictator to get some civil unrest. And that made me think about someone that we haven't heard from in a while, Alexei Navalny, who was even in prison before able to organize a protest against Putin. Can we still expect anything from him and his organization, or Russian civil society in general, or have they been completely kaltgesteld or driven out of the country? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. What I do know is that Navalny's team is working from abroad and is trying to influence the public opinion in Russia. What we do know is that the Telegram channels are quite influential in Russia, but that also holds true for the so-called mail bloggers. So the military bloggers that are tolerated by the Kremlin, by the way, and also accepted by Putin. Some are in close contact with the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. So yes, there are Telegram channels that produce information also linked to the Navalny team. But in my view, if you see how many people read the mail bloggers, I think that outnumbers it. So far, what we do know is that Putin really controls the internal narrative in Moscow, and he uses the mail bloggers for that, although they become more and more critical, and I think that is even more dangerous than Navalny right now, because the mail bloggers are really critical. But I don't believe that there is any threat to Putin right now. If you look at the opinion polls carried out by the Nevada Centre, is it? It's still 70 or 80% who is in favor of this, and the Russian people are also better capable than we are, at least in my country, of coping with the challenges of economic warfare. This is something that is really fresh memory for most people. This happened in the 1990s also. So no, I don't see that this will have a huge impact now. What will happen in the future, I don't know, but not now.
Just scanning the room to see if there is a last question. Gentleman over there.
Yeah, thank you. Going back to the theme of tonight was also, let's say, a plea by you for more political and geographical thinking. That's also one of your themes of your book, The Battle for Europe, which I think should be translated, by the way.
We're working on it, but it's a nightmare.
But I think in order to think like that, and even more, to act like that, you need also in your countries a kind of resilience. You just mentioned that the Russians are much better equipped for economic warfare. When you would put that in our country, I think that we are not very well equipped for that. And that in particular in a landscape, a political landscape, which is more and more scattered, in not only in the Netherlands, but also in other parts of Europe where you see a rise in the populist parties. So if you go in that direction, how, in fact, if you make this link with internal politics, are we able to bring our countries in this kind of thinking, that it is not only about thinking about having economic advantage on the short run, but also look much more in the longer term?
I think that it is possible, because when you have a choice, you will not do it. But if you have no other choice but to do it, you will do it. So if your vital interests are at stake, and they are at stake right now, then you also have, you can also explain to the public that really something is changing. I see it already changing. I don't know how it is in your country, but in my country it is changing already. I see it in the reactions on what I do in the media, which are massive, and there is really an acceptance that the world is changing, that China is indeed a systemic rival, that what happens in Ukraine and with Russia can really challenge our security. That's exactly what the minister just said about European defense. So there is a real acceptance that something is changing. What I see, and that is quite interesting, is that in politics it's very difficult to make this change, at least in my country. They accept the changes that are taking place, but how to translate it in policies, that is extremely difficult. And I can understand that, by the way, because it is extremely difficult. And there was also a discussion about what are we going to do with our values, your question. It was an excellent question. You don't have to skip your values, absolutely not, but you have to do it in a completely different way. And that acceptance, that is something that I really see right now, and that makes me rather optimistic.
Wonderful. I think we're coming to a natural end of the evening. I wanted to thank you both very much for a super insightful analysis. I think we've all learned a lot, but also for providing some hope, I think, because I think both of you are saying that Europe isn't as weak as we sometimes think it is, or as divided as we think it is, and that it is facing a lot of challenges, but there are also signs of hope that we will find a good way out. So thank you very much. Thank you also to the audience for all your insightful questions, and thank you for being here.
You're all welcome to stay for drinks. So you don't have to rush out. Please be welcome to stay a bit. There will be